That's my disclosure statement. I think in the interests of openness, I should also tell you that, strictly speaking, I'm neither a risk assessor nor a nutritionist. You got the sense from my academic background that I'm a geneticist by training, so maybe I'm free of any bias in this area. Here's what we're trying to accomplish, and I think this broadly relates to what others are going to do as well, but what are we trying to accomplish? I'm going to talk about the role that we've played in incorporating systematic reviews into nutrition topics, our experience using a couple of signal examples, and what lessons we've learned that may be of use to you going forward. So there are 3 levels of decision making on this slide. I just thought I'd let you know what to expect. That's the first. Level 1, what would I do for myself or for someone in my immediate family? Now, the others you can probably guess are ones that occur at different levels, so prepare yourself. At level 1, a decision is influenced by your personal experience with, let's say, the disease and the capacity to deal with risk. How many people would that likely affect? Probably very few, you and your immediate family. Level 2, if you were a physician or a healthcare provider, what would I recommend to my patient or to my client? A physician who's making a recommendation for patients is influenced by prior experience, but the scientific evidence may play a greater role. And likely this affects hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. Level 3, what would I recommend to the nation or to the world? And it's always been my feeling that if you're making recommendations at a population-based level, then it's all about the evidence and a rigorous assessment of that evidence, because it affects hundreds of thousands and even millions of people. I credit this organized concept to Leon Gordis from Johns Hopkins University, but I've found it to be a very useful principle for organizing my own thinking about this. The goals of evidence analysis, evidence synthesis, you're trying to use evidence for something, and the goals are, in the cases that I'm most familiar with, to provide confidence that the effects, both positive and negative, of the intervention under discussion can be attributed to that intervention and likely to nothing else. Further, we want to develop an evidence base to guide both research and public health policy, and that's the sort of situation that we find ourselves in the Office of Dietary Supplements. It is my belief that evidence development for dietary supplements and for other nutritional interventions as well should follow the same principles as for other interventions. Well, what is the evidence base? It comprises results from a whole range of studies. And I've emphasized here human studies, but I recognize that there are some pieces of information that can only be gained from preclinical, including animal studies. The goal, though, of putting together an evidence base is an unbiased estimate of the attributable effects in what kinds of populations, and basically to whom should these apply. The evidence may or may not, and usually is not, sufficient to make firm policy decisions, but it's what it is, and you have to make the call anyway. You know this, I'm not going to spend any time on it, but it's just a reminder that we think about a hierarchy of evidence. All of this is evidence, but there's a hierarchy, and you're aware of the strengths and weaknesses, we'll come to that in a minute, of various parts of this triangle, of this pyramid. Limitations, for example, of preclinical studies used in decision making are that they do provide evidence of mechanism of action, but that may or may not be relevant to humans. How many times have you seen a compelling rat study that really depends on the unique metabolism of rats that has nothing to do with humans? Case reports and case series in humans provide clues, but maybe nothing more. Those can be extremely important. Think of the first AIDS cases that were identified as case reports. a whole body of thinking emerged from case reports. That's how we should be using them. Epidemiologic and other kinds of studies absolutely provide clues in a real-world situation, but they may and often are confounded. Can you deal with the confounding? Sometimes, sometimes not. And interventional studies, including RCTs, are a direct test of the intervention, but it is extremely fair to say that the results of RCTs, randomized controlled clinical trials, may not be generalizable beyond the population that was the subject of the intervention. So the Office of Dietary Supplements, we were created in 1995 from the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994. I became the director in 1999, and in 2000 we created an evidence-based review program. This was a blinding flash of the obvious. It was my contention that there were very few fields in which an evidence-based approach couldn't be more important than in the context of dietary supplements. And this is largely because we all eat, so that's 100% of the population. Half of us take dietary supplements on a regular basis. That's now known. We all have opinions. And sometimes the opinions outweigh the science. Sometimes they outstrip and outrun the science. And I felt that it was very important to develop a coherent approach to the identification and clarification of the evidence supporting the use of dietary supplement ingredients. So our program includes the systematic reviews of efficacy and safety of dietary supplements. We do this almost exclusively in collaboration with a sister agency at in the Department of Health and Human Services called AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. They maintain a network of evidence-based practice centers around the United States and Canada, and their work applies across the board: insurance claims, drug interventions, device interventions, now increasingly nutrition and dietary supplement and other nutrition interventions. Our purpose at the NIH is to use these to aid in the development of research agendas. But now these have been used more broadly than that. Examples of systematic reviews that we have sponsored through the Evidence-Based Practice Center Network include the following: ephedra. That was our trial by fire in 2000 or so, 2001. And there were some real challenges associated with doing a systematic review on ephedra. The questions that were asked about that review were: what's the evidence of efficacy and safety in the context of physical performance enhancement and weight management? The first one was very easily dealt with because the literature contained virtually no relevant evidence. There was an awful lot of case report, although not all of it published. Certainly a lot of product sold for this purpose, but the evidence base was pretty weak. Well, it's okay as far as I'm concerned. I'm not looking for an opportunity to take something apart, but rather to identify where are we and what can we do moving forward. So in terms of physical performance, there was little evidence of ephedra efficacy. Ephedrine, with and without caffeine, there was abundant evidence, but that wasn't the product in the marketplace. By the same token, there was an increasing concern. In terms of weight management, there were several controlled trials and other relevant pieces of information, but at the end of the day, it probably included hundreds of subjects, hundreds, not many, in fact, in very different kinds of situations. So a systematic review was fairly challenging. A small amount of evidence. What did that evidence point to? A modest and beneficial effect of ephedra in weight management over the short term, but no interventions were longer than about 5 months. Well, that's not a hit on ephedra. Most obesity drugs in the marketplace up until a few years ago had little direct evidence beyond 6 months or so. So that wasn't a big deal. Ephedra-containing products, however, were the subject of a great many case reports of harm, both evident and subtle. And at the end of the day, the total body of evidence that looked at the efficacy and safety of ephedra was based on intervention studies for efficacy, case reports for safety. Isn't this often the way things are? We don't design clinical trials with safety outcomes. That's not ethical. We can often get safety signals, but trials are not powered for that kind of information. We need other ways of being able to do that. I spent a moment on that, and now I will dispense with ephedra because we survived that. Ephedra products didn't. The FDA was in a position not long after the release of this systematic review and using other evidence that they had generated and synthesized to be able to take ephedra-containing dietary supplements out of the US marketplace. Much more interesting and a lot more fun, I have to tell you, were ones that we sponsored on omega-3s, on soy, on multivitamins, probiotics, vitamin D, and calcium. And I'm going to use two examples of those to illustrate some principles that were important to us as we were thinking about the total body of evidence. I will state, full disclosure, I don't have a pony in the race. I don't slam supplements, I don't sell supplements. We're expected to be the organization that provides the unbiased evaluation of available evidence. So that's what we do. With respect to vitamin D, and I think Carl Keene is going to spend more time on some interesting aspects of vitamin D in his presentation a little later. But we have had an interest in vitamin D in the Office of Dietary Supplements and beyond that at the NIH for quite a number of years. Our own role began with a couple of conferences that we co-sponsored with partners. The first was co-sponsored with the Child Health Institute. The second was sponsored by the National Cancer Institute, and we co-sponsored it on vitamin D and cancer. These were the genesis of two systematic reviews that we sponsored that were done by ARC evidence-based practice centers. The first on vitamin D and bone health that was done by the University of Ottawa, and the second, more broadly, on vitamin D and other health outcomes was conducted by Tufts University, and I think one of the authors of that systematic review is in the room. At the same time, we were beginning to develop a better understanding of what was needed in the general area of vitamin D research. And we needed research in vitamin D to frame questions that would help us to make public policy recommendations. These could be the subject of a whole other set of talks, but not to put too fine a point on it, one of the fundamental weaknesses in the vitamin D literature was a very poor understanding of what vitamin D status meant. And part of the reason for that was that the tools available were not perhaps robust enough to be able to be broadly applicable to a population. So we and partners at the NIH and beyond developed basic analytical chemical approaches to the evaluation of vitamin D status. This was done in collaboration with NIST. We collaborated with USDA to apply improved tools for vitamin D measurement, now to a broader array of foods and supplements. And more recently, we've been the focus for developing an international program for the harmonization of vitamin D status in public health surveys around the world. The key questions that we asked in these systematic reviews, and that if I harp on key questions, it's because I harp on key questions. The major questions that we wanted to know the answers to were, what was the effect of vitamin D with or without calcium on a whole array of clinical outcomes? These included growth, cardiovascular disease outcomes, weight, cancer, immune function, and so on. I'll cut to the chase and say that at the end of the day, it was really only the questions related to skeletal health that stood up to the tools of systematic review. And I'll comment on that in a bit. We also asked about the effect of vitamin D with or without calcium on some key intermediate outcomes. We also asked, now those are intervention kinds of questions. So what's the effect of this on that? You can really only answer that question directly using intervention studies. But the next two questions, what's the association between vitamin D status and clinical outcomes, and what's the association between vitamin D status and surrogate outcomes? Those are questions that can best be answered by observational studies. And my point is that systematic review can be used quite effectively, not only for questions that arise because of intervention, but also to address associations. So what were the outcomes? 165 primary studies and 11 systematic reviews pointed to evidence that vitamin D supplementation does reduce falls and fractures and bone loss in men and women 60 years and above. It wasn't possible to separate the effect of vitamin D from calcium supplementation. That's not a problem, but if you're trying to attribute an effect to vitamin D alone, you can't do it. Very, very sparse data on skeletal outcomes for other subgroups. And separately here, there was the evidence against other possible health outcomes, chronic disease prevention, health status. The data were weak and inconsistent and couldn't be used to make recommendations. Am I saying that it's not possible that vitamin D can have those effects? No. It's that the evidence available for analysis and synthesis was not sufficient to be able to use those health outcomes as the basis for making public health recommendations. And further, it was also difficult to identify a specific blood level of 25-hydroxyvitamin D that indicated optimal bone health in all population subgroups, let alone a level of vitamin D that indicated optimal health for other possible outcomes. So the Institute of Medicine was contracted by the governments of the US and Canada to convene a panel to look at the dietary reference intakes for vitamin D and calcium, and they did. They framed a lot of their questions, but not all of their questions, around the results of the systematic reviews. Systematic reviews are very amenable to certain kinds of questions and not others. And they released new numbers, and I'm not going to talk about those. If any of you wish to, I'm happy to. But do you remember what I told you at the beginning, that we use this to frame questions for further research? And these were the kinds of things that we learned from the systematic reviews of vitamin D that are very important for us moving forward. First, exposure is incompletely understood and measured, obviously because of the impact of sun exposure on vitamin D status in populations. And we're getting better at measuring vitamin D content in the available food and dietary supplement sources. In terms of health outcomes, there are a great many promising clues, but the fact is that there are inconsistent findings of benefit. And it's my contention as well that issues about safety at high levels of chronic intake need to be addressed. And finally, and this is an area where we've spent quite a bit of time, measurement of the status of 25-hydroxyvitamin D. There has been the potential for incorrect interpretation of vitamin D status, especially when assessing trends over time. And I think it's only when you use data sets like NHANES that you realize drifts over time can have pretty important consequences for interpretation about health status of the population. And finally, clinical practice guidelines, which we don't do, but which we hope we can inform, because it's fairly important that people make clinical practice decisions based on reliable information. I'm going to turn to another one. And please don't memorize this list. It happens to be the same kind of thing that we did with vitamin D, and that is to address the health effects of omega-3 fatty acids from foods and dietary supplements against a host of of clinical outcomes listed on this slide. Obviously, the most robust data set had to do with omega-3s for cardiovascular disease and related issues. But there was, and still is, a burgeoning literature on the potential benefit of omega-3s against a host of conditions such as these. Let me concentrate briefly on the cardiovascular disease outcomes, because like vitamin D, there was really only one category in which there was a sufficient amount of information to really be able to take it seriously at the time. These reviews were conducted and completed in 2005. In terms of secondary cardiovascular disease prevention, so in those who've had previous evidence of cardiovascular disease, there was evidence that omega-3s reduced all-cause mortality and other cardiovascular disease outcomes. Parenthetically, since then, this effect appears to have vanished. And there's some apparently very good reasons for that, but this is a moving target. In terms of primary cardiovascular disease prevention, however, while there was a large and consistent effect found on triglycerides, and that's the basis for a lot of increasing activity related to omega-3s in cardiovascular disease, there really was little or no effect found for other cardiovascular disease risk factors or markers of the disease. Why? Because there's so much evidence that people point to say there's benefit here. Why aren't you seeing that in the intervention trials? And part of the reason for that is something with which you're very familiar in nutrition, and that is that the data sets are very heterogeneous. I remind you, we're not doing this to take shots at people, but rather to address areas where we can improve the science moving forward. But the heterogeneous data made it difficult to evaluate. The methods for estimating fish or omega-3 fatty acid intake were highly variable. The background diets, in retrospect, were not consistently, reliably understood. And the methods for reporting results were likewise different. The good news was that adverse events from clinical studies of omega-3s appeared to be quite minor, but it also needs to be stated that clinical trial reports of omega-3s did not always report safety outcomes, harms, or even how they might have addressed those in a clinical trial were they to find them. Is it time to re-examine the evidence? Perhaps. So anybody around in the 1970s? Anybody remember Monty Python's Flying Circus? Do you remember the Red Cardinal who would jump in at a certain point with his band of guys and say, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition? Well, the way I put it is, in the context of this, and this is a stretch, but nobody, when they were doing studies in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, they didn't expect to be meta-analyzed. Now they should. Now the way in which studies are conducted should be very carefully framed to provide good and reliable information and contribute to the overall body of evidence. What we learned from our reviews, and I listed them at the beginning, was there are several issues that pervade the field of dietary supplement and probably nutrition, clinical nutrition research as well, more broadly. For supplements, for sure, identification of the products or identification of the intervention that's used. This largely applies to plants and plant extracts, but arguably also to nutritional interventions where food extracts are used. Methods for characterization, both of actives or marker compounds, contaminants, and then providing products that are reproducible and reliable over the period of investigation. Protocol concerns, and this is the clinical investigation component. I mentioned a couple of these briefly, but here are some other ones. So the populations under study we need to fully recognize that if you're doing a clinical trial in a very narrowly focused group, then that's the group for whom the results can be generalized. Beyond that, you take your chances. I hope we will be getting a better understanding of who are responders and who are non-responders before we plan clinical trials. The timing and duration of intervention, the endpoints, the doses or serving sizes. And a lot of this has caused us at an organization like the NIH to seriously consider the role of earlier phase studies in identifying the answers to these sorts of questions before we engage in ambitious, expensive, and long-term clinical trials. So I'm going to summarize here in a couple of slides. I think it's fair to say that systematic reviews for nutrition topics over the years have been controversial. Here's my take on what they do and don't do, and you may have your own list. They can cover all of the relevant data. That's the key there, is asking the questions. They do reduce the potential for bias, and they increase transparency. Why? Because the rules for inclusion, exclusion, data arraying, and so on are required as part of the publication. And so you, if you felt like you were in a position to be able to reproduce that systematic review, you ought to be able to based on the publication. It certainly improves the efficiency of policy-making groups, such as DRI panels. But it provides a tool, not the only tool in the armamentarium that policymakers need. What they don't do is answer questions that are not in the literature. It's tough. There's literature and there's literature, but for the most part, in the scientific peer-reviewed literature, if the issues have not been addressed there, then they're not going to come up in systematic reviews. And as I mentioned briefly before, they often don't cover all of the available literature needed to make policy decisions. They don't shift the decision-making process from policymakers to non-experts. They certainly don't diminish the need for expert opinion or scientific judgment. At the end of the day, people have to make decisions based on an uncertain body of literature. The questions are what's paramount. There is flexibility in implementation of systematic reviews. We've learned this with nutrition topics, but I promise you it's not the only field where this has been the case. I mentioned that we have experience with using intervention trials only for certain questions, epidemiologic studies only for others, and preclinical studies for other kinds of questions as well. It depends on the question. They inform, but they don't dictate, and you have the ability to be able to keep them current. So ODS has had the benefit of a lot of very valuable colleagues in this effort, both within and outside ODS, both within and outside the government. And I'd like to thank all of them and thank you for your time.